We'll call the meeting to order. And pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, November 8th, Bill C-63, a second act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 22nd. Point of order, Mr. Dussault.
C'est un rappel au règlement, juste pour...
A point of order just to complete what is happening this morning, because at the last meeting that we had, we adjourned very abruptly on a motion.
No, this one worked.
I was saying that I was wondering about this, and so I look to you and to your wisdom, Chair, but my understanding is that at the last meeting of this committee, there was a motion on the table that was not voted upon. The adjournment was very abrupt, and therefore no decision was made with respect to the motion on the table. On a point of order, therefore, what will happen this morning? Are we not going to pick up where we left off at the last meeting? That is to say, with a debate on the motion that my colleague, Mr. Poilievre, moved. That's how I remember the last meeting, and I would seek wisdom on this.
The motion can be lifted off at any time. Your motion is the way I understand it, correct? Yeah. So the motion that you moved, that given ongoing media revelations, etc. If you care to it, you can lift it off the table at any time, now or later or tomorrow or.
J'aimerais le faire maintenant, Monsieur le Président.
I'd like to do it now, Chair. And
Mr. Dussault, do you want me to read the motion into the record?
Oui, you can read it to remind everyone of what we're talking about.
Okay, that given ongoing media revelations that could implicate some Canadians in aggressive tax avoidance or tax evasion, the committee invites Stephen Bronfman, Revenue Chair for the Liberal Party of Canada, and Leo Culber, former Senator and former Chief Fundraiser for the Liberal Party of Canada, to appear before the Standing Committee on Finance before November 30, 2017, to answer questions relating to their offshore assets in jurisdictions that are considered to be tax havens. So the floor is yours, Mr. Dussault, and then I have Mr. Poilievre. Go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. I don't want to repeat everything that I said at the last meeting, but I am somewhat disappointed that we have to resume a debate on this. We could have decided at the last meeting last Thursday. However, my motivation is to shed light on the two persons mentioned in the motion, why they are saying today that they acted very legally, completely legally, by amassing their fortunes in these countries. Obviously, they declare their income there, and they're benefiting from the situation. They are benefiting from these investments that are abroad. The purpose of the study, therefore, is to know what strategy was used so that we, as a House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, can look at that article more closely, because I find it deplorable and immoral. It's being said that this is not illegal, that it is legal, but it is immoral to my mind. It is an abusive use of tax legislation to avoid tax. And there are experts in the field who have legally placed their business. So I would like to be able to hear their position and to hear what can be done to reach a solution in this. I spoke for 5 minutes at the last meeting about this. I don't want to go on over long. But what motivates me in raising this issue again today is to seek the support of my colleagues so that we can put in place measures to counter this type of fraudulent or, at the very least, immoral use of the tax system.
This motion, I'd like to thank the member for his original motion. He brought this matter to the attention of the committee. Et je crois que c'est important
and I think it's very important to discuss it. Here, we are the Finance Committee. It is our responsibility to discuss issues, matters that deal with tax and income tax. There was an important, a very significant revelation with respect to the amounts that were paid, or more precisely not paid, by individuals who took advantage of tax havens. And it is up to us to expose the truth in this matter. Canadians, all Canadians, have to pay tax at an increasingly high level, which is a major burden for the middle class. 87% pay more tax, income tax, than they did 2 years ago, about $800 more. And clearly, one of the causes of this increasing tax burden is the expenditures of this government. Their expenditures have increased phenomenally, but another cause could be the fact that there are some very, very wealthy people who use strategies that are legal or perhaps not legal at all to avoid paying their fair share of tax. To date, the government has targeted farmers, small and medium-sized business owners, people who are suffering from diabetes, to take on the increasing tax burden. But billionaires that are able to hide their money offshore are protected. And they have a shelter, a tax haven, which is not available to other Canadians. Other Canadians that do not have the means to avoid tax. So I believe that my colleague from the New Democratic Party is quite right in moving his motion. The motion that seeks to study the issue in the Finance Committee, and I would say that on behalf of the Conservative Party, we feel that the government should supply full transparency in providing this study.
Any other speakers, or am I going to the question? Okay, go ahead. The question. Recorded vote, please. Madam Clerk.
Mr. Fergus.
No.
Mr. Cervera.
No.
Ms. O'Connell. No. Mr. Grewal.
No.
Mr. McLeod.
No.
Mr. Poilievre.
Yes.
Mr. Albus.
Yes.
Mr. Kamiec.
Oui.
Monsieur Dussault.
Oui.
Defeated.
Motion is lost. Okay, before we go to the witnesses on Division 10, we do have a request for the project budget, which is related to Bill C-63, a second act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 22nd. And this expenditure is related to a number of witnesses that have come to present their views on Bill C-63, and in the amount of $14,000, correct? $15,500. Do we have a motion to accept the budget as presented?
Moved.
Moved by Mr. Fergus. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. All right, turning to Division 10, which relates to trade within Canada and harmonization of energy efficiency requirements. Again, thank you for your patience. I know you've been here several times. Mr. Furtuck, who's the Director General, External and Trade Policy Branch at ISED, Ms. Hill, who's the Special Advisor, Strategy and Innovation Policy Sector at ISED, Ms. Henry, Director General, Office of Energy Efficiency at NR Canada, and Ms. Sharf, Director, Equipment Division, Officer of Energy Efficiency at NRCan. Thank you. And is someone starting off with a short presentation? No short presentations. Any questions on Division 10? 4 people here just dying to answer them. Go ahead, Mr. Commish.
So I have a question. It's section, so the clause 222, section 26 of the Act is being repealed. So I went to go find what this section 26 of the Act is, and it says it's regarding the Energy Efficiency Act, section 26, and you're going to go through it. It talks about the publishing process with the Canada Gazette, and it seems to me like you are removing the requirement to publish changes to proposed regulations. That's how I read the section, because the entire thing is being removed. So is that the effect? Is that the intention?
Thank you for your question. So that's not the intention. The intention is to just update the Act. So this part of the Act, Section 26 of the Energy Efficiency Act, was put in place before the regulatory process that's now directed through a cabinet directive through Treasury Board. And so there is a requirement to consult with stakeholders and provinces and territories already. And it's the same time period. It's 75 days. We're also governed by the World Trade Organization requirements for obligatory consultation on regulatory changes. So what this does is it just takes something out of the statute because it already exists in other areas now.
Is that requirement a legislated requirement in the other statutes?
Well, the cabinet directive is a directive that's published through the cabinet and is implemented by the Treasury Board and the Treasury Board Secretariat.
So it's not. But it's not a statutory requirement then. It's
not a statutory requirement, but it does govern how departments operate when they're doing changes to regulations, and it is public.
Sorry, but so then you're asking us to remove a legislated requirement to consult and to publish in the Canada Gazette a regulation in exchange for a cabinet-level directive to Treasury Board to consult and to publish in the Canada Gazette.
Effectively, yes. What I would say is the cabinet directive is a long-standing directive. It's been in place for a number of years, and it's what governs departments in all the regulations that they do. So my understanding is that there aren't that many pieces of legislation that still have a legislated requirement for consultations because it exists in other arenas that the government follows. And the cabinet directive on regulation making, I'm not sure if that's the technical term.
Can you maybe explain to me then, if the cabinet wanted to change that directive, how fast could it do so?
It'd have to be through a cabinet process, which I think would be led by Treasury Board. So there's a process that occurs, and then the directive is a public document.
Directive is a public document. So the public eventually would know if the government chose to stop gazetting regulatory changes, it would be a public that would be a public document.
Sure. I mean, there is a very robust process of consultation, pre-consultation that we would do with our stakeholders and with provinces and territories anyway. We have very effective relationships. We talk to our stakeholders, we consult Canadians, we consult the provinces and territories when we're making a regulation. And on top of that, there's a requirement before you go to Gazette 1. When you're in Gazette 1, there's a certain time period you have to follow. Those changes have to be taken into account and considered, and then it goes back to Treasury Board before it becomes an effective regulation. It is a long-standing process. Okay.
Any further questions? The repeal of the Agreement on Internal Trade Implementation Act, so that act is just being replaced by the new act. That's correct, right? And it seems to me I read this somewhere, but I don't remember. Why is the Timber Marketing Act repealed?
So I'll start with your first question with respect to the Agreement on Internal Trade Implementation Act. So the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, the agreement itself, replaces the existing Agreement on Internal Trade from 1995. So that legislation is no longer required. As such, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement Implementation Act will replace the Agreement on Internal Trade Implementation Act. So that's why that repeal is specified in Division 10. And your second question with respect to timber marking is a very outdated act from, I think it was 1870. And it only applies to 3 provinces. What it did was required that timber being floated down inland rivers be marked.
Thanks, yeah.
That's right. So it's just...
Yeah, we're a little different now. Yeah, thank you. And the other question I had on this, though, in terms of the provinces and the Government of Canada came to an agreement on internal trade. What's the process for making future changes? Because we're not exactly at free trade within the country, even with this agreement. What's the process for making improvements?
For the question, Mr. Chair. So in relation to changes or amendments to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, the practices in place would be similar to those that were in place with respect to the agreement on internal trade itself. And interestingly, the AIT, over the course of the better part of 20 years, in fact, had 14 different so-called protocols of amendment. And that was the process that was put in place to introduce administrative monetary penalties, to strengthen provisions related to labor mobility requirements and so on within the agreement. So all provinces, territories, and the federal government would get together, would agree on a new reform or net liberalization, and there's a mechanism within that where once each jurisdiction has agreed to that, you'll see that there's an updating of the agreement itself. So you could see an amendment to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement in a subsequent year, which would incorporate that new net liberalization. Thank you.
Okay, any further questions from any of the committee members on Division 10? With that, thank you very much, and we'll go to clause by clause consideration of the bill, Bill C-63. I should mention to committee members before we start that we will have an interruption about 11 o'clock, right? The Finance Committee from Iraq is here, and they wanted to meet with the Finance Committee, and because we couldn't do that, what we did instead was invited them in to basically observe how we operate. So I know everybody will be in their best behavior. And we'll probably go through a round of introductions as well. So that'll happen at 11 o'clock. Okay? So dealing then with Part 1, amendments to the perhaps I should say, pursuant to Standing Order 75-1, consideration of Clause 1, the short title is postponed, and we will go to Clause 2.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. We want to work as efficiently as possible on the clause by clause. As you know, these processes can often be arduous. As just speaking on behalf of the Conservative delegation, we're open to allowing passage on division. We know the outcome of the votes anyway, but we would like, with respect to the amendments, to have the opportunity to clarify some of the effect of those amendments. So we did receive them on Friday. I know that was the earliest that we could get them. There are a few on which we are not 100% sure what the effect of the amendment would be, and if it would be possible to have brief questions to officials when they come up. I would appreciate that opportunity.
That's not a problem, and the legislative clerk has blocked areas that no amendments are in place, and we can move them on division. Officials from several departments are here. When we get to amendments, we'll take the time, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions however you feel do. Okay, there's no amendments from clauses 2 to clause 19. Shall to clause 2 to 18. Okay. Shall the clauses 2 to 18 carry? On division? Clause 19, we have PV 1. And Ms. May, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to remind committee members, I'm here because you passed a motion that requires that I be here. If you hadn't passed that motion, I could have presented these amendments, as is my right, at report stage. But this is an end run around changing the rules of legislation through PROC by having each committee pass identical motions. It was originally dreamt up by Mr. Harper's PMO and has been replicated by Mr. Trudeau's PMO. So just to state my objections to this process, I have 11 o'clock a different clause by clause on the Arms Trade Treaty. So I hope to be able to present all my amendments here before I have to go through the same exercise at a different committee at the same time. My amendments are specifically, and I have to say overall this is a very good bill. I actually voted for sending it to committee. I think I'm the only opposition member that did. But there was a commitment made by the previous government. Mr. Harper committed in 2009 at the G20 summit in Pittsburgh to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. This commitment was carried forward in the Liberal platform, and it is a recommendation at this point from all global financial institutions that every country eliminate its fossil fuel subsidies. It's the recommendation of the World Bank. It's the recommendation of the International Monetary Fund. It's the recommendation of the International Energy Agency. This amendment that I'm putting forward amends what is essentially improvement on the status quo coming forward in this bill, and that goes to, on page 28, under subsection 19(1)(b), there is a change to take us from a 100% write-off for unsuccessful oil and gas drilling, otherwise known as Canadian exploration expenses, to reduce it to about a 30% write-off. So it is a step in the right direction, not fulfilling the promise initially made in 2009 by Mr. Harper and again by Mr. Trudeau in the election, but at least moving in the right direction. But it came to our attention that advisors in the oil and gas sector are advising their companies to speed up action to do more unsuccessful oil and gas drilling before the deadline in this bill. Advice to oil and gas companies suggests that we have until the end of 2018 for oil and gas companies to continue to incur expenses, and if commercially possible, companies should consider accelerating their drilling. So my amendment's very straightforward. It's to close the transition period so that unsuccessful oil and gas drilling will not receive a tax benefit at 100% until the end of next year, but end this year. And that's the effect of this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further discussion on Ms. May's amendment, PV1? Dan? Mr. Elvis?
Just to say, Mr. Chair, that while I appreciate the member is wanting to hurry up the process, one of the biggest things that we heard during the pre-budget consultations when we visited right across the country was many in the business community are feeling a lack of certainty when it comes to the way that this government approaches things. So consultations where they can't meaningfully engage because there's so many different subjects. So for us to suddenly switch something on, it creates less certainty. And I just think that right now the business community is really suffering under a lack of that, so I will be opposed to this amendment.
Okay, with that, all those in favor of the amendment PV1? Opposed? The amendment is lost. Shall Clause 19 carry? On division? Carried on division. Clause 20, PV2, Ms. May.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et maintenant, j'ai...
Thank you very much, Chair, and I have the opportunity now to explain why the Green Party has put forward this amendment. The officials of the committee, perhaps, that one could imagine that this is a government amendment. It is because of that. But it is PV, and they don't put down PG. It's not necessary to add the words. It is the same words intended only to affirm the transition period for oil exploration. Thank you.
All those in favor of PV2? Opposed? Lost. Shall Clause 20 carry? On division? On division. There's no amendments from clauses 21 to 169 unless somebody wants to pull something up. Whew, a lot of pages. 169, right? Shall clauses 21 to clause 169 carry? On division? On division. Okay. Clause 170, amendment proposed, NDP 1. Mr. Dussault.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. And indeed, this is an amendment to Clause 170 that clarifies that the Minister shall not unilaterally act in terms of the excise taxes or fees that will be imposed on cannabis. This is completely in line with what the provinces are asking of the federal government. The provinces are feeling at a disadvantage with respect to the government now when they had a preliminary discussion on the excise tax on cannabis. The provinces were very clear. Most, if not the majority, asked for the legalization of cannabis, and that much of the burden would be on the back of the municipalities and the provinces. The municipalities are very concerned about this possible burden that they will have to shoulder, and to ensure, so I'm seeking to ensure that there is adequate measures to be taken that will not allow the government to impose a heavier burden, a tax burden, on the provinces and the municipalities. The provinces will have to deal with the large share of the responsibility surrounding the legalization of cannabis. 50-50. 50-50 there was in the eyes of the provinces something that was fair, but they were told by the federal government that that was not adequate, and therefore 2 weeks ago the government brought up a new proposal and laid it on the table, and once again it came back saying that it would be 50-50 sharing of the excise tax on cannabis. Really, this is a slap in the face yet again for the provinces. They don't agree with that, and they today are seeking to making their point clear to the Finance Committee. This is intended to ensure that there is consultation that there will eventually be a mutual agreement on a coordinated way to impose taxes on the sale of cannabis. It's completely in line with what the provinces are seeking. It would allow for the addition of this section 8.71, which would oblige the minister to consult to move away from the present atmosphere of confrontation and lack of respect for the provinces. I ask my colleagues at the table to support my motion here so that we will come out of this matter with a consensus that will provide adequate taxes and will provide a fair tax system for the sale of cannabis. I invite my colleagues, therefore, to support my motion.
So I do know that the official opposition would like to hear from some of the witnesses on this one. We're dealing with Part 4, Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act. If we could have some officials come forward and we'll have a discussion. Mr. Colombe and Mr. Marcel. Okay, we're open for discussion. Mr. Poilievre.
The effect of this amendment would be to require a meeting or a discussion among federal and provincial officials on the share of taxation each level of government would receive from the taxation of cannabis. Is that correct?
Do you have a copy of the proposed amendment before you?
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead, whoever wants to take this on.
So, the way I read the amendment is it requires an invitation of the representative from the province. It's not totally clear whether it requires the unanimous consent if before an agreement is entered into with the willing province. So it's a little bit ambiguous in that sense.
But it would require a meeting of some kind.
Well, if the amendment is adopted, it will require the Minister of Finance to invite his provincial counterparts.
Invitations.
Okay, that's all.
And in the absence of this amendment, what happens? That's the process now.
Well, if I may, the Minister of Finance has already started discussions at the federal, provincial, territorial level and on the need for a coordinated approach on cannabis taxation. So those discussions will likely continue in the upcoming meeting of finance ministers in December. So for that reason, this amendment might not be necessary in terms of the process that has already started and is taking place. Thank you.
Ms. O'Connor. Connell.
It's fine. That was going to be my point, that my understanding was this already has happened, the invitations already happened in the meetings in December.
Mr. Duceau.
Je comprends qu'il y a une réunion qui
I understand that there is a meeting that will be held in December, but the provinces aren't satisfied with what's been said to date, and it's precisely the point I was making. At the first meeting, they had some discussion, but they said clearly that 50-50 wasn't adequate. But 2 weeks ago, the Minister of Finance published a draft bill, if you like, and a consultation document to ask the provinces, rather, what, yet again, they thought about a 50-50 cost sharing. And so I think that it's very difficult to consult in this way. I don't know. It seems to me that the minister is just going to confirm his position, his existing position, 50-50 cost-sharing arrangement in December. And he's going to say, whether you like it or not, this is what I'm prepared to do. So I feel there should be a mutual accord, a mutual agreement in principle. And as to goals, because without that, it would be very difficult. The minister appears to be unilaterally moving ahead on a 50-50 cost-shared basis, but I believe that there should be an agreement. Because, as we saw with the health transfer, the government is going to move ahead with its program, and it's going to sign piecemeal agreements with each province. And that is the approach of a government that imposes its ideas on others. It might consult, but there is no point to the consultation because it will still impose its ideas on others. What we've seen in the past has been that case, and I think it'll be the future as well.
Discussion on NDP, on amendment NDP 1. All those in favour? Recorded vote. Madam Clerk.
Mr. Fergus.
No.
Mr. Sabara.
Nope.
Ms. O'Connell.
No.
Mr. Graywall.
No.
Mr. McLeod.
No.
Mr. Poilievre.
Yes.
Mr. Albas.
Yes.
Mr. Kamiec.
Oui.
Monsieur Dussault.
Oui.
Amendment is lost. Shall clause 170 carry? On division? On division. There's no amendments on from clauses 171 to 175. Shall clauses 171 to 175 carry? On division? All right, then we're starting Division 2, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank Agreement Act. On Clause 76, we have an amendment from the official opposition, CPC 1. Who's taking the floor on this?
I am.
Mr. Commissioner.
It's my amendment. So after having heard the witnesses and the minister speak to this, I'm unsatisfied that this is the right thing to do with Canadian taxpayer money. And so I'm proposing this amendment to remove those 5 lines out of the bill. And my concerns are that we are rushing into this, that we will be financing infrastructure projects overseas while we know we have a $2 billion deficit here in infrastructure spending between what the government intended to do and actually has done. There's less than 30 projects completed in Alberta out of 174. And there's other concerns from international experts on the purpose of the Asian Infrastructure Bank. And so I took the time to go read what President Xi Jinping of China has said on it, and distinctly connects the One Belt, One Road initiative with the AIIB. The Asian Infrastructure Bank is supposed to further the interests of China's foreign policy, and I don't really see why Canada should be financing that. The second part is witnesses before the committee said that a human rights environmental review had been done of each and every single project. And if they had done that, they would know that actually there's been a total lack of transparency because that documentation is not available online. We are through this project and future loan guarantees, so as the loans are paid out, if we proceed with paying our share into it, buying our voting share, we would be financing pipeline projects in Asia, would be receiving loan money indirectly from the Canadian taxpayer. And I think fundamentally that's wrong. We can't be doing such things when seemingly the Canadian government is opposed to supporting energy jobs in Canada while we're making it easier for them to be financed overseas. I think that's wrong. So President Xi Jinping has said this furthers China's foreign policy interest. Also, there's just one other part. The witnesses said repeatedly that this is an opportunity for Canadian construction companies to bid on these projects. So trying to make the connection that these Canadian companies might receive these funds in the future, and that's incorrect. Also, Canadian companies could already bid on the projects, but I have taken the time to look at international reviews of these infrastructure projects that have been financed by this bank. And in International Relations of Asia Pacific, a gentleman called Jeffrey D. Wilson, the Asia Research Center from Murdoch University, points out that the majority of the contracts, a preference is given for Chinese construction contractors in AIIB-funded projects. And this is a gentleman who took the time to review the procurement and bidding process and found that Chinese contractors, in fact, do get a preference when bidding. So I just don't see the wisdom in spending the $375 million US at this point, and I'd like to see this amendment pass so we don't waste taxpayer money.
Mr. Polyev and then Mr. Dussault.
Yes, well, I find it interesting that this government, which is opposed to pipelines, is in favor of using Canadian tax dollars to fund them abroad. The Green Party leader is here today. She said that she wants to end fossil fuel subsidies, but she votes in favor of a bill that would subsidize the transport of fossil fuels in Asia through the construction of pipelines funded by Canadian taxpayers. So it's clear that there's no objection to pipelines outside of Canada, and there's no objection to subsidizing fossil fuels as long as those subsidies don't help Canadian workers. The Liberals and the Green Party are just fine with those subsidies. Our party believes in creating jobs and opportunity here at home. We also have to tackle the growing problem of inequality, where wealthy international financiers are making a fortune off the backs of taxpayers around the world, and in particular here in Canada. These so-called infrastructure banks are designed to transfer the risk of mega construction projects off of the backs of the investor and onto the backs of the taxpayer. We believe in the free market, where risk and reward go together. We do not believe in socialism for the wealthy, welfare for the wealthy, and that is exactly what these infrastructure banks are. So we call on the government to champion the free market and more equality and Canadian jobs, standing up for Canadian workers and Canadian taxpayers, not the interests of making the wealthy wealthier in faraway lands. Thank you.
It's probably not proper for me as chair, but I do believe Mr. Polyev's facts are wrong and that the Liberals are opposed to pipelines. I believe the Prime Minister came out and said if they meet the environmental guidelines and did support Energy East, etc. In any event, Mr. Dussault.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I just want to set out my agreement with this Conservative amendment, which is intended to bring back to zero Canada's contribution to the Asian Infrastructure Bank. Up to some $480 million Canadian dollars are involved. I think that it's not said often enough. They are intending to take the taxpayers' money and use it in international development to support structures, infrastructure in Asia. I think that this is a very misguided decision, and that is my opinion. I don't know if there's anybody here around the table that would believe in that this investment in this bank would improve the interests of Canadians abroad. If you want to improve Canadians' lot in life, there are other ways of using the $480 million. Don't send it abroad. Use it where it can be. It is a form of payment that we will never see a return on. Here in Canada, it's coming out of our pockets, going into the pockets of somewhat doubtful foreign divisions. I have some doubts about the safeguards that are being put in place with respect to the investments in this type of infrastructure bank abroad. I do not feel that they suffice, and I ask for support for the Conservative motion. I thank my Conservative colleagues for moving it, and that $480 million would be far better spent in Canada than in the Asian Infrastructure Bank. We want to spend that for our entrepreneurs here in Canada, Sherbrooke, and throughout Canada.
I have on my list Ms. May, then Mr. Albus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Under these strange rules in which I find myself here, I'm normally not allowed to mention to comment on the amendments that are not my own. But since I was directly attacked by Mr. Poilievre, I'd like to make it very clear that I support this amendment because it's not an infrastructure bank in Asia to build pipelines. On the contrary, it's the Asian Development Bank, and its primary goals are alleviating poverty. Since 2015, our money has gone to
Go ahead.
The Asian Development Bank funding?
This is not.
Okay, apologize, Mr. Commissioner, but I would make it very clear that there's no money in this budget going to build pipelines in Asia. I oppose fossil fuel infrastructure anywhere in the world, and under the current commitments that Canada has made for its overseas funding, it said very clearly just recently in Bonn at COP23 that the funds that we provide overseas are also going to go through a lens that they are not to be promoting any increase in fossil fuel use, infrastructure, or emissions overseas. That's a very clear commitment on our foreign assistance at this point.
Thank you, Ms. May. Mr. Albus, and then Mr. Poilievre.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I certainly appreciate Ms. Mays' comments to try and clarify the comments. However, Mr. Commitch has done a fair bit of research on which projects have been approved, and among them are pipeline projects in Asia. And so, I would encourage all members of the House of Commons to, really familiarize themselves with it. I would just like to say that, particularly when we had officials here, we asked the questions about whether or not these projects are financially feasible. Unfortunately, it sounded that the officials had said that they're not feasible if they were to be done on their own without some sort of government backing, which would reduce encourage investors to put money in and to see those projects go forward. We have in this country Energy East. The government likes to say that they made a business decision to decide not to go forward. I think Canadians would be quite alarmed to hear that we are actually fortifying investors in Asia to do pipeline projects, and we are not doing the same here in Canada. So particularly since the government seems to have been playing footsie with a slow, inevitable march towards realignment, I don't think there's been a proper debate in either House of whether or not we want to turn our back on multilateral relationships which have created a lot of stability in the world. I think there should be a debate as to whether or not we should be proceeding. And when you have these small developments go bit by bit, what we are is inching towards that without actually having a proper discussion. Lastly, again referencing our multilateral past, Mr. Chair, you, of all people, should know, in your capacity as the Canada-U.S. Parliamentary Group, should know that this may end up being quite provocative to be investing this kind of money when we have allies such as the United States and such as Japan, which probably would not look kindly upon this. Particularly at this time where we're trying to close the gap with NAFTA negotiations, or we're trying to close the gap with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Albus. Mr. Poilievre, and then Ms. O'Connell.
It is important for members to know what they're voting on. The leader of the Green Party said that we're voting on the Asian Development Bank. That is wrong. We are not voting on the Asian Development Bank. We're voting on the Asian Infrastructure Bank. She also says that this will not fund pipelines. In fact, Mr. Kamiuk has done a tremendous amount of research on the projects already approved by the Asian Infrastructure Bank. And I have that project list which Mr. Kamiuk has assembled. And it includes natural gas infrastructure and efficiency improvement project in Bangladesh. This is a gas transmission pipeline capacity increase in that country. Then there is a second project, the Trans Anatolian natural gas pipeline project to be co-financed with the World Bank. That's in Azerbaijan. It, again, is a natural gas pipeline. So, by supporting this bill, the leader of the Green Party is supporting subsidies for fossil fuels. She moments ago had said that she was against that. Now she's voting for it. The government is supporting subsidies for fossil fuels in faraway lands. They put every regulatory obstacle possible in the way of building a pipeline between Alberta and New Brunswick, a project that would have created countless jobs for energy workers in the west and refinery workers in the east. It would have allowed us to get fair prices for Canadian oil and eliminate our reliance on Saudi Arabian and Venezuelan oil. But that project has been blocked by countless regulatory obstacles that this government has put in its way. Meanwhile, they're forcing these same out-of-work Canadians to pay on their taxes for pipelines in Bangladesh and Azerbaijan, projects that will surely profit the world's well-connected and wealthy elite, but projects that will do literally nothing for the Canadian economy. So on this side, we will be standing up for Canadian workers, Canadian jobs, and Canadian taxpayers. We will not support this bank, which is designed to pad the pocketbooks of the world's well-connected and wealthy. Thank you.
I'll allow you in, Ms. Bay. Maybe I know you've been challenged, and I also know the rules, but that's fine. The floor is yours, and then we'll go to Ms. O'Connell.
My first point is that to vote for an omnibus budget bill this large, my own lens is, do I approve of about 99% of what's in there? In terms of this item, Asian Infrastructure Bank, I will be watching closely. The commitments the government has made are not to fund, and I shouldn't use the word pipelines because I'm not against pipelines. It's a question of what's in them. And improvements in efficiency in use of natural gas in a country like Bangladesh arguably reduce greenhouse gases in that country. As far as the nonsense that we just heard, and with all due respect, Mr. Poilievre, the Energy East pipeline, which was withdrawn from consideration by its proponent, and credible analysis by energy economist Andrew Leach at the University of Calgary, and I think it makes a very strong point that with Keystone approved, TransCanada just didn't have enough market for two pipelines. But that pipeline, if completed as planned, was going to have a mixed amount of content. About 80% of what was to go through the Energy East pipeline was mixed bitumen with diluent, for which there is no refinery in Atlantic Canada that can process it. It was primarily an export pipeline. So we have these debates. I don't think that amendments to C-63 and clause by clause is an appropriate place for a pipeline debate, but I do think it's important to set the record straight. This government, unfortunately, the Liberals are all for pipelines. They approve them all over the place. Personally, and for the Green Party, it's not about the pipelines, it's what's in the pipeline. And we will oppose any pipeline of bitumen mixed with diluent, which is a substance that can't be cleaned up and poses a risk wherever it is shipped.
Okay, we go all around the block on issues at this committee, Ms. May. There's no question about it. Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr.
And then
Chair.
Mr. Albus.
I never thought I'd see the day to hear the Conservatives say, they're so against socialism for the wealthy, because that's what I remember from the last 10 years, but that's okay. We'll talk about the fact of jobs. The question was about jobs for Canadians. Well, I think our two records can speak for themselves. Some of the worst job records we saw from the previous government. In terms of pipelines, another one, we'll see the we'll see the records show for themselves how many were completed by the previous government. In terms of subsidies for fossil fuels, I mean, the Conservatives, I think, are having a really hard time with their messaging because our job numbers are doing very well and because of our economy is growing. But so they want to really twist and turn and, get to whatever they can in terms of messaging around some of these amendments. And really what we heard, if you recall, from the officials was that part of Canada joining the Asian Infrastructure Bank was about having a seat at the table to start influencing and changing the conversation and changing behavior. And if we're not at the table, then we really can't influence that. And to pretend for 1 second that Canada should not be involved in a global economy, I mean, again, coming from Conservatives is something that I'm very surprised, especially these former Harper Conservatives, is just absolutely shocking to me. But I think the point is, and I think most Canadians see the fact that we are living in a global economy. If we want to move and make progress on things like infrastructure and international development and environmental standards and labor standards, then Canada has to have a seat at the table. And that's what we heard about. And it's not operating in one silo or another, only doing things in Canada and never talking or interacting with global markets or global businesses. And I don't think that's what the previous government, previous Harper government did. But now, because they really can't talk about the economy because of their track record, they have to twist themselves into pretzels to really talk about subsidies for fossil fuels. But really, this is about having a seat at the table and changing the conversation, and Canada having that influence to move to a sustainable global market.
Okay, thank you, Ms. O'Connell. Looks like we got a full court press. From the official opposition, we have Mr. Albas,
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Kamish,
Thank you, Mr.
and Mr. Polyev, and we are on CPC 1. I think we're going broadly around it, but go ahead.
Sure. Thank you,
Floor's
Mr.
open.
Chair. Just to make sure that people are correct of the record, that median wages over the 2005 to 2015 was 12.2%. Which was one of the only areas in the developed world where we actually saw median wages for Canadians go up compared to other places. We also had the Great Recession, which some people might say could have easily gone into a depression if not for the good work done by the previous government. I think most members would say that, particularly during minority years, that can be a difficult thing. And during the time that I was here, Mr. Chair, we saw that Canada did actually the best out of all of our partners coming out of that recession. 1.2 million between after the recession in terms of jobs. So that record's there. Also, when we talked about doing international development or multilateralism, we would talk about child and maternal health care plans. So we would see more children that would be born and be able to, and their parents to be able to take care of them. So those are the kinds of things that we did. Trans-Pacific Partnership was something that the previous government invested a lot of time in, because we do see that Asia is, and the Pacific in general, is a good place to be doing business, and that's how we did it. We did not do it, though, by subsidizing pipelines. And as a British Columbian, I do have to say that when we see investments like Pacific LNG not go ahead, $36 billion proposed investment not go ahead because of the enormous amount of regulatory pressure put on it by this government. They put a regulatory cap on how much emissions it could go, and it made the project non-viable, only to find out now that they're willing to subsidize natural gas projects and other types of projects like that in other countries. This is the problem. And the government can say that they're all about multilateralism, but at the end of the day, you are taking taxpayer money and placing it into the benefit of taxpayers of other countries. And I think that many people may just say, if we're not going to be supporting here in Canada, why are we supporting those projects? And I really do hope the government members take a note of this, because at the end of the day, you have to go to your constituents and actually say to them, $375 million US was, and it was, and you were at this committee, and you didn't say anything other than supportive bromides. Thank you.
Thank you. We are moving fairly far astray off the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but we went down this road, so I'll have to allow us to complete it. Mr. Kamish, then Mr. Polyev.
We've gone down this road now, so I feel, to the amendment, I'm just trying to remove the funding component to this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, so-called, Well, since we talked about employment numbers, you'd know that CanSIM table 2820011 shows the job numbers are pretty much the same as they were all the way back in about June, July of last year, because there's been a drop and it came back up. So I'd be really careful about using which employment numbers you want, because I can use StatsCat numbers to demonstrate to you that half of the drop in the unemployment rate is due to workforce participation dropping. There are less people looking for work. People are dropping out of the workforce because of all the tax hikes. It's not worth looking for it. That's not me. That's StatsCan. Just go look at the data. It's right there. But to the amendment, it's been said that this isn't about pipeline infrastructure projects in Asia, but it is about them, because our 21 projects are already on the book. The day the government announced that it was going to join it is the day that the TANAP Azerbaijani project was approved, on the exact same day. So how could you not know? The witnesses said that there was a human rights and environmental record review done on every single project, which means the government would have been reviewing it ahead of time before joining this project. It would have known that the dollars being given, at $375 million US dollars being given of taxpayer money, is going to be going to finance these loans being given to these pipeline projects. It has to. Inevitably, it will go there. Middle-class taxpayers are going to be financing 2 pipeline projects overseas. And I don't see how that's fair to the widows. I don't see how that's fair to the orphans. I don't see how that's fair to taxpayers in Canada to be financing those projects. Witnesses have also said before this committee, in error, that this is an opportunity for Canadian companies to bid. They could bid on these projects ahead of time. And I have experts from Australia, from Asia, saying this is furthering China's foreign policy interests, not Canada's. And 2, that Chinese contractors are preferred contractors when it comes to bidding on these projects. So this money, very well may, go to finance middle-class jobs in China, and the moneyed elite who will be getting these loans, but de-risking was the term used. That's what this money is going towards. De-risking whom? Well, those people who are fortunate enough to have a seat at that table. We actually are not purchasing a seat at the table. We're not going to be a member of the Board of Governors or the Board of Directors of this bank. We may, perhaps in the future, we have a 1%, less than 1% voting share that we're getting for this money. And I just don't see the value. I don't see the bang for your buck. Like back in Alberta, we say get her done. I don't see us getting her done here.
Thank you, Mr. Kamish. Mr. Poilievre, and then Mr. Ferguson.
The comments from across the way demonstrate that the Liberals do not even understand what free trade is. They think free trade is a group of political grandees getting together in a faraway land deciding how to spend other people's money through complex international institutions unaccountable to the people who pay for them. That's what this so-called Asian Infrastructure Bank is. It'll take a total of $100 billion tax dollars from working people around the world and put it into the hands of a well-connected, well-lobbied for, well-lawyered few. And they will be able to use that money to secure loan guarantees and loans. And the losses that will result from projects gone bad will then fall on the backs of the world's taxpayers, of which Canadian taxpayers will be responsible for $500 million. That's not free trade. What the government doesn't understand is that countries don't trade, people trade. Individuals buy things from one another across borders. And a true free trading economy, the government should remove the barriers to the flow of goods and services across those borders. It should not forcefully expropriate the money of the taxpayers in those countries to provide financial assistance to wealthy international investors well connected enough to get their hands on it. That is effectively the difference here. We believe in voluntary exchange, where buyer and seller trade things because each believes he or her is better off with what they get than with what they had. They believe in forcing people to contribute to projects that they don't support in faraway lands they've never been, on projects they don't often even know about. And so we are going to continue to support true free trade over here on this side of the House of Commons, and not these programs of socialism for the wealthy and the well-connected. Thank you.
Okay, then Mr. Fergus and then Mr. Lightbound, and we are on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank Agreement Amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
We're a little broader than that, I will admit, in the discussion, but go ahead, Mr.
Well,
Fergus.
it did start off with the discussion, and I'd like to thank the honourable member from Calgary for his analysis. I think it's not entirely reflective of the full diversity of the benefits of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but most important thing is that we have a full discussion of the benefits and perhaps some of the disadvantages. We can have good people of fair, reasoned perspectives can have a fair debate. What I really don't appreciate is the lack of coherency, I would say, in terms of the arguments which are being marshaled by some of my honourable colleagues opposite, in terms of pulling in little bits and pieces and then conflating them into coming up with a conclusion which will support an ideological perspective that they may have. I don't think anyone on this side said that the AIIB is a free trade agreement. I'm not certain where that came from. We were talking about different aspects of different measures in which we would want to support. We would like to support free trade. We also want to make sure that we support and be a part of the global community to make sure that there is going to be, Mr. Chair, a fair development which is going to be happening all over the world, because Canada, you know, Mr. Speaker, I mean, let me just back up a little bit. I guess I come from the perspective that it's very important for all of us to have self-interest, but if all that we have is only self-interest, what kind of people are we? We need to have some idea of being able to working with our neighbors and working with our brothers and sisters around the world. We cannot just stick, and Canada is not an island to stay upon itself, to invest only in itself and only for things which only benefit ourselves. We need to make sure that we are part of a larger global community and we take our perspectives at doing so. And I have no problems doing that, and I'm certain that my honourable members in most contexts would probably agree with that perspective as well. I think that's that is key and that's important. This is one tool in which we're able to do that. And it's one tool which I'm proud to be that Canada's taking a step to being a part of. And it's part of the long and proud history that we've had over the last 80 years, certainly throughout the 20th century, in being part of these organizations, these multilateral organizations which seek to improve the welfare and well-being of citizens around the world. And it's one thing which I'm a part of. It's interesting that the honourable member also brought up issues in regards to the economic record of the past, of the previous government, and saying that we would have gone into depression. It's fascinating that they use the term depression, because every economist, every statistic would demonstrate that their economic record was only second to that of another Prime Minister, R.B. Bennett, during that depression era in terms of annual economic growth. And when we take a look at that anemic record that had existed then compared to the 3.5% growth that we have now, Mr. Speaker.
I would like if we could
it's just
not
because
get
the door
into,
was opened.
I know we went very broad on this, but I don't want to get into a debate on this government versus that government. I think we went far enough on that point. Mr. Lightbound.
Yeah, no, I'll be very short. I just wanted to thank Mr. Kmiec for his extensive research on the Asian Infrastructure Bank, and I'm sure he would have noted that many of the projects he's mentioned, the World Bank is a co-lender on these projects. So if we push his reasoning, I guess he would suggest that Canada should, exit from the World Bank or reconsider its engagement. But I don't see that Canadians have an appetite for disengaging from institutions such as the World Bank. and I think that Canadians have a strong desire to see Canada being part of discussion about development around the world. And so I was just curious if his reasoning was that Canada should exit institutions such as the World Bank, but in the interest of staying on the proposed amendments, I'm not seeking an answer necessarily right now. But if he wants to, I'd be happy to hear.
We will give him the opportunity if you want to answer now, and then maybe Mr. Polyev can close this debate, and we'll move on CPP 1 and then go to CPC 2. Mr. Kamish.
I'd be happy to. So this is turning a little bit, I get to be like in question period now, but I'll actually answer the question. No, of course not. But you're asking us to spend $375 million US of new money. Not every project has World Bank money attached to it. Let me give you an example. The Duke M Port Commercial Terminal and Operational Zone Development Project. The project status right now is it's under construction. If your government had been reading the project and reading the news and newspapers and reading the analysis of it, you know that there are massive concerns about the abuse of migrant workers and unfair labor conditions for those migrant workers in Oman. I refuse to believe that this government somehow would have done, like the witnesses said, a human rights review and not noticed that fact at some point. So we're transferring $375 million US of new money that will be financing the loans that will eventually make its way to this project. Because of course, for each of these projects, you don't give all the loan money up front, you give it in pieces over time. So Canadian taxpayer dollars will go towards this Omani project where there are human rights concerns. Not all projects are funded by the World Bank. Some projects receive money, some, not all. The IMF is giving money to some of them, the ADB, but not all of them. The unique thing about this bank is that it's led by the Chinese government and is explicitly for the One Belt, One Road purpose, OBOR. The one purpose behind this project is to find opportunities to further China's economic interests. They have said that explicitly and repeatedly. And all we're getting here is less than 1% of the share. No seat at the table. We're not on the board of directors. We're not anywhere involved. We're not talking about institutions we've been part of, the Bretton Woods institutions we've been part of for 50 plus years. We're talking about a new institution not led by one of our allies.
Mr. Polyev.
Thank you. And again, I think I have to reiterate what members across the way have said, that Mr. Kamiuk has done phenomenal service to Parliament through his research and through the data that he has dug up. He is really leading the charge on this file. But I do have to respond to Mr. Fergus, who says that this is about selflessness and altruism. That we need not be so selfish, that we need to show generosity. Well, this is another classic liberal contradiction. They are very generous with other people's money. You know, if liberals believe that the best way to help the world's most needy people is to invest in an infrastructure bank, why don't they do it with their own money rather than forcing Canadian taxpayers to fund it? We believe on this side that free trade helps everyone. This is not free trade. This is forced taxation to fund a faraway bank that will help people, help wealthy people in a faraway land protect their own financial interests at Canadian taxpayer expense. Normally, international aid programs are designed to help the world's poor. The Liberals have now conjured one up to help the world's rich. The investment bankers, the private equity fund managers, those who will invest in these projects will get underwritten by Canadian taxpayers. $500 million Canadian tax dollars will be poured into the pockets of the wealthy elite who are going to benefit from it. So we are moving a motion under the name of and the leadership of MP Kamiuk to cancel this expenditure and keep that $500 million in Canada in the hands of the people who earned it.
Okay, Mr. Fergus, hopefully the last comment on this round.
I hope it is, Mr. Speaker, and I am not. I'm certainly not one fellow to have a sensitive skin. I'm certain the honourable member didn't imply that that Liberals, speaking as a Liberal, as an individual, that I don't spend my own money in supporting causes not only in Canada but around the world. I don't think he knows me well enough to know whether or not as an individual that I do that. And let me just assure him, and for the record, that a fair bit of my salary and a fair bit of my family's work is done for activities which are certainly not in my personal interests, narrow economic benefit, but to help out my neighbors, not only in my community, but around the world.
Then on CPC 1, all those in favor of CPC 1 on a recorded vote. Madam Clerk.
Mr. Fergus.
Je suis contre.
Mr. Cervera.
No.
Ms. O'Connell.
No.
Mr. Graywell.
No.
Mr. McLeod.
No.
Mr. Poilievre.
Yes.
Mr. Albas.
Yes.
Mr. Kmiec.
Yes.
Monsieur Dussault.
Oui.
The the amendment is lost. CPC 2 still relates to the same clause. Mr. Kamish.
So this second proposed amendment specifically deals with line 4 and 5 on page 239 of clause 176. During the testimony, both the minister and the witnesses used a different number than the number available in the budget document C-63 itself. The document itself says $375 million US, while the budget on page 181 says the budget 2017 proposes to invest $256 million over 5 years for Canada to join the Asian Infrastructure Bank. I'm simply trying to amend and reduce the number to match with what the budget said was the correct amount to spend. Now, I never quite understood the discrepancy between the two numbers. Perhaps the Liberals wanted to double down, which the numbers almost match. And as my colleague Mr. Albas mentioned, this would also help the government avoid some currency exchange risk if we convert also the currency to Canadian dollars instead of keeping it in US, because we might approve it and then currencies are traded freely and they might change, and the government might wind up paying actually more money than what we intended and approved. I think we've gone over all the deficiencies of the Asian Infrastructure Bank, but I think this is really just about going on what's on page 181 of the budget document itself, which is $256 million over 5 years. And there's a discrepancy, therefore, with the $375 million US in Bill C-63.
Okay, Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I appreciate Mr. Kamich's amendment in terms of clarifying the numbers. We heard testimony from the officials of where the difference in numbers were, and one was that Canada is setting an upset limit of $375 million, but currently there's only $199 million US worth of shares available. But the idea is that since Canada is not a founding member, that should additional shares be available, that Canada could purchase more up to that upset limit. So we heard that testimony. I thought it was made very clear, but I'm happy to clarify that, because the initial investment is $199 million US that's available, and that it's an upset limit should any additional shares become available after other members choose what share limit they'll move forward with. So that's the clarification, and that's what we heard from testimony from officials.
We have officials here. If anybody wants them to come forward and make that request to Mr. Kamish.
To join us.
Are officials here who can maybe if people have questions on this issue, you're entitled to ask them. So I have Mr. Kamish first, and then Mr. Sabara. Mr. Kamish.
So since we have the officials here, may I start with just the initial $199 million that Madam O'Connell referenced. So when would this future money be requested for, and how would parliamentarians have a say if the money is dispersed or not?
The additional funding would be requested if there was the availability of shares. So when the shares became available to purchase, if the government wanted to purchase those shares, at that point the funding would be requested, and it would be returned to Parliament through the estimates process as part of the regular appropriations process.
So, but the budget actually says 256 million over 5 years. So did the government change its intentions from back in March and has new intentions now? And would those intentions potentially change in the future? That's the issue here. Is you're saying in a future time the government may choose to purchase extra shares if those shares become available, and wants to keep the money that Parliament would approve, kind of on the side in a separate bank account for future use, potential future purchases of these shares?
So in the budget, there's the exact amount is being requested for the shares that are currently available for purchase. The legislation provides the up to maximum amount for Canada's possible maximum shareholding allocation based on the bank's formula. The delta and the difference would not be appropriated or set aside in budgets until the regular estimates or appropriation process had been gone through. So in accordance with Budget 2017, while the legislation will provide for a potential upper cap, the appropriation at this point is limited to the 199.
So here's the issue I have, because the header says payments out of Consolidated Revenue Fund initial subscription. My understanding of something that says initial subscription would be exactly that 256 million in this 199 million American purchase initial subscription. Future subscriptions should then return here in a bill format where then parliamentarians could debate and say, question the wisdom, whether this was the right decision or wrong decision. I think most members know where I stand on this. We could then return here to have a secondary debate about perhaps we could call it the second subscription or another subscription. But this says initial. So my understanding of initial would be that it'd be 256, not 375 million US dollars.
So the initial subscription describes the first capital that's being put into the bank, so by the founding members and by the members that are joining in the second round. When we talk about additional subscriptions down the line, that normally relates to a general capital increase, which would be seen as a subsequent subscription. So the initial subscription speaks to the larger initial capitalization of the bank, and that's why that language is used, distinguishing that from the initial purchase from Canada to a potential subsequent purchase up to our maximum allowable share allocation.
So this kind of sounds like I'm going out to buy a car for $10,000, and then instead of getting a loan for $10,000, I get it for $14,000 because I might want to do some upgrades, get new tires, fix something on the car. Like this is what this sounds like. You're asking for more money than you need because you may want to use it in the future to invest in this bank some more. Am I misunderstanding it?
I think an important distinction is distinguishing between the legislative process and the appropriations process. The legislative process is requesting legislative authority to purchase up to the maximum allowable share that Canada could have under the allocation formula. The appropriation, which is Budget 2017, is only speaking to the 199. If the decision was taken by the government to make additional share purchases, at that point an additional appropriation would be requested by the government, and that would be brought back to Parliament.
Okay.
It would have to go through the budget process at that stage?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, I have Mr. Sabara and then Mr. Albas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. The question that I had was answered in terms of the initial funding amount. To increase it, would it have to go through the process again? So that was answered. My understanding, this funding allocation will occur over a 5-year period. The current allocation.
Correct.
Okay, that is it. I just wanted to add one comment on the banter that went back and forth on the earlier discussion. The Asian Infrastructure Bank. My understanding is there are obviously a number of countries, I would say dozens of countries that are participants in the Asian Infrastructure Bank?
Correct. There were 57 founding members, and currently there's 80 current and prospective members.
And many of those members can be defined as economies that are in countries that we do an enormous amount of trade with, and obviously have growing economies. Many of them located in the Asia Pacific region.
Correct.
many of those countries are also signatories to the agreement that the Conservative government signed in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, otherwise known as a TPP.
We have not done that cross-comparative analysis, but we can certainly do so. But
safe to assume there's some cross.
There is indeed overlap.
Yeah, there is overlap with many of the countries that the Conservative government that these individuals were part of, that signed on the TPP, are part of the Asian Infrastructure Bank. Correct? I just wanted to put that up. That's it, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Albas, and then Mr. Poilievre.
Yeah, by going back to the issue of the of the effect of Mr. Kmiec's motion here to make an amendment, you've already said that the government could, at a later date, decide that it wants to purchase more shares. So technically, it could ask for those appropriations to do so, and they would have to come back to Parliament. Is that correct?
For the appropriations, they would have to come back to Parliament, correct?
So why would we not want to, I could see why government members don't want to obviously cross their own government. But again, they've said that the initial share was in the public interest. They could support this, Mr. Kmiec's amendment. It would then be where, if the government made a good decision, it could bring those results back, and then we could have a further examination on that. But right now, this is speculative. We've already raised a number of concerns, and I think that the government would be well positioned. And then I think there would be a benefit, Mr. Chair, to having the government come back, make more persuasive arguments than we're hearing today for additional monies. And I think that creates better accountability. I think it would create a little more transparency around the government's intention. And I think we would have a much finer debate because then we would actually be able to put what the government's investment in the so-called bank and be able to see what came out of it. So I'm going to be supporting Mr. Kmiec, and it does not sound like this will interrupt with the government's plan. It will just simply make sure that if they want more money, that they have to come back to Parliament and ask for it.
Mr. Poilievre, and then Mr. Kmiec, and hopefully that's it.
Well, I have to respond. Mr. Cervera once again conflated free trade with grand international governmental institutions headed up by political insiders and international financiers. There is a difference. We believe in the free flow of goods between peoples. Free trade is about knocking down government barriers so those goods can flow. This is not a free trade institution. And if anything, it is an anti-trade institution. It will principally fund the export of Chinese goods westward, away from Canada, by building on the Silk Road strategy of the Chinese government. That Silk Road does not point towards Canada. It points away from Canada. As for the facts, Japan, arguably the most important market to which TPP would give Canada access, is not a member of the Asian Infrastructure Bank. So the member across is incorrect in suggesting that this bank is merely a reflection of TPP. And so there is no benefit to Canada's TPP initiative in pouring $500 million into this bank. Thank you.
Okay, final point, Mr. Kmiec.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to reiterate what Mr. Albas said is I think parliamentarians, what we should be doing as much as possible is matching the legislative and appropriation process as closely together as we can, because it's then easier for us to track the money when things do go wrong, and they sometimes do. It also makes it easier for future parliamentarians who are coming into here, and I'm speaking as one of the new parliamentarians who was elected in 2015, the estimates, appropriation, and legislative process do not always match and make it very difficult for members of parliament to track the money as is being spent. So I am simply trying to do is to match it on what's on page 181 of the budget, so that it'll be an easy comparison to make in the next budget between what was spent and what is being asked for. And I think it's a very reasonable request is that whatever the government proposes to do, that then be reflected in their legislation. I think that's a very minimum. We saw the Speaker make a ruling and split out 4 components out of it based on a new standing order. I think the same principle applies here. The substance has not changed. It's the amounts that have changed in this. And as parliamentarians, I think we owe it to our constituents to be able to track and report the money as best that we can, and this would make it simpler.
Okay, then calling the question on Amendment CPC 2 to Clause 176 on the recorded vote, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Fergus.
Against.
Mr. Sorbera.
No.
Ms. O'Connell.
No.
Mr. Graywall.
No.
Mr. McLeod.
No.
Mr. Poilievre.
Yes.
Mr. Albas.
Oui.
Mr. Kimietch.
Oui.
Mr. Dussault.
Oui.
Amendment is defeated. On the same clause, amendment to Clause 176, NDP 2. Mr. Dussault, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this is a very reasonable amendment here, and I hope all the members will be able to support that. It's a transparency amendment, and I will read it to make sure everyone is on the same page on this amendment. The Minister of Finance must, at the end of each fiscal year, prepare a report setting out the payments which were made to the bank out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund during the previous fiscal year, as well as the purpose of each payment, and must cause the report to be laid before each House of Parliament on any of the first 15 days on which that House is sitting after the report is made. So it's very simple. It's to have the Minister of Finance, after each year, to table a report saying what was the payment to the bank, the amount, and what those money were used, on which project they were used. So it is very reasonable, and it will give Canadians transparency over their own money. Canadians pay tax every day, and they expect government to be responsible with their money. And we are in front of the fait accompli that government will go ahead with this investment in the Asian bank. So the only thing, the main thing they should do is at least provide transparency over the money that is spent in this bank and what project were financed. So I ask every members to support that amendment. Very simple. It doesn't impede the government to go ahead with this project, but at least Canadians will see where their money went, because it's not the government's money, it's Canadians' money. And as I said before, I don't think it's the best way to spend Canadian money, but at least if the government decide to do so, please be transparent and provide Canadians with the details of those spending. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and I hope to have support of every members.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dussault, and I have Ms. O'Connell, and I would like to ask officials following Ms. O'Connell's comments, what is the process now to try under the bill without this clause to have transparency or inform the public of where monies are being spent? Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's actually my question to officials is, can you outline how, you already mentioned in your earlier statement how it shows up in estimates, but can you outline what the process will be in terms of outlining the funds that are spent to parliamentarians?
So very happy to. Transparency on payments and expenditures is a critical aspect of Canada's international assistance engagement, and indeed how all funding from the international assistance envelope is spent. So that includes funding that goes to international financial institutions such as the AAIB. There's a multitude of different reports where all of this report information is already reported, and if Canada joins the AAIB and makes these payments, this would become part of those reports. So that includes the statistical report on international assistance that follows the report to Parliament on the Government of Canada's official development assistance that is under the ODAAA Act. So that is both a quite robust narrative report. I think this year's version was about yay thick, describing in some detail the projects that are funded with international assistance funding and the results that are achieved for it and the purposes for which the money is used. The statistical report that's associated with that provides the very detailed financial statements. We also report on our international assistance, which would include this funding to the bank, through our OECD DAC reporting, which is a requirement of our membership to the OECD DAC. So that information also appears twice a year, which speaks to the funding that would be made as part of these payments, as well as the purpose of those funds. And lastly, in terms of Canada's more domestic, slightly more parliamentary focused process, the payments to the AAIB would also be reported in addition to those external reports. Those payments would also be reported through the estimates process as well as in the public accounts, which provides further transparent reporting.
Anything further?
No, that clarified it.
All right, Mr. Albas and then Mr. Duzot.
So just, again, you kind of rifled off a couple different ways the government will be reporting. I don't think the estimates really gives other than just a number. And so while numbers are helpful because they're easy to count, sometimes they don't always measure what counts to the person that's reading it. Because there's more than just dollars and cents. So what those other reports, are those tabled in Parliament?
The report on the Government of Canada's official development assistance, which is required under the ODAAA legislation, that is tabled to Parliament every single year before September 30th, or if the House is not sitting during that period, within 5 days of the House starting to sit again.
So I do think that there's been enough public interest raised by many of the members at this table, maybe not by all, to warrant, though, having a report specific to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, just simply because of the nature of it, and I would encourage all members to support this amendment. Again, when we give delegated authority to a minister or to the Governor and Council, that goes with a tremendous amount of ability, and we should be able to ask to have reports specific to parliamentarians so we can share with our constituencies what the government is doing with those specific expenditures and with that delegated authority. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Albas. Mr. Dussault.
Thank you, and thank you for the answer. My question is, where exactly, you mentioned a lot, where exactly we would be able to find project by project information of how much Canadian money went to which project? Can you just clarify on which document you reference, where we can find project by project information?
So in Canada's official development assistance report, so the one that's tabled to Parliament as part of the ODAAA, that does include project by project information. For example, the Asia Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the EBRD. But that is pertaining more generally to Canada's international assistance, that focus. All of these banks also have their own annual reports, which do provide very detailed information on a project-by-project basis, and that is particular to all the projects undertaken by the bank.
I understand the bank will issue a report saying what they finance, and I'm sure Mr. Kimmich has a lot of these reports saying what the bank, in which project they were involved, but it doesn't tell where Canadian money were spent. And you said Canadian report on project by project, but you just mentioned this bank, and this bank. So it's not by project reporting, from what I understand. So is there any way we can see project by project, Canadian money were spent on the Asian Infrastructure Bank precisely, not on all international development financing, but on this issue today. Can we find that information? I'm not sure. Maybe you can clarify that the reports that the Infrastructure Bank will publish, does it tell which country provided money for project by project?
So the way that the Asia Infrastructure Bank has set up for its capitalization is that the Canadian funding goes into that capitalization and then is leveraged for a series of different projects. So you're not able to say this one Canadian dollar, 50 cents of it went to this project, 25 cents of it went to this project, 25 cents went to that project. It is done slightly differently in some of the other development banks where on occasion specific funds are set up separate from the general capitalization of the bank, and in those cases we're able to track those specific projects. But the way that most of the general capital for these development banks is set up is that there's not a Canadian portion that can be discretely tracked. It's a general capitalization. Is there anything you wanted to expand on that, Neil?
So it's just to clarify that if Canada has a 1% shareholding, then essentially 1% of all projects would be funded with resources that were provided originally by Canada. And I think the key point here, as Dr. Giles has mentioned, is that what we've provided is share capital to the bank. And the bank then takes that share capital, which it uses to leverage up on international capital markets through borrowing, which it uses to provide project financing. So it's difficult, as has been mentioned, it's very difficult to say that our funds are used in these specific projects, other than to say, with a 1% shareholding, we can attribute roughly 1% to everything.
So I gather that the answer is no. We can't see project by project Canadian money, which one they finance. So that's why my amendment is so important. It will oblige the government to do the work and find out where Canadian money were spent. And I'm not sure the 1% by project is really an answer to that question. I don't think it's respectful of Canadian to just say every project was financed 1% by Canadian money. And I would be interested in see all the projects and which, if they really fit into the Canadian interest, the 1% we finance on every single project that this bank takes up. So it doesn't answer your answer doesn't tell me that we will see what my amendment wants to provide to Canadians. So that's why it's so important. And the actual mechanism is not enough. So that's why we need this one. To make sure that Minister of Finance gets the answers I want, and I think most Canadians would want.
Mr. Kamish?
So I typically don't like doing hypotheticals, but the $375 million US, if the government in future saw an opportunity to purchase an extra portion of shares, and for whatever reason, let's say this Chinese-led bank decided to do that, with this then reporting mechanism that Monsieur Dussault is proposing, would then that capture future payments and provide a means for Parliament to track the money if future disbursements were made for share purchases as well?
Any disbursements that are made that are funded through the international assistance envelope, which includes this AIB shares purchase, is reported in the series of reports that we've listed and that we've spoken about, including the report that's tabled to Parliament every year. Any future payments or purchases would be included in that reporting.
But this would be a separate report, I assume. If this amendment passes, which I hope it will, this would create a separate report specific to AIIB share purchases, and Mr. Dussault is indicating project transfer of money. Is that your understanding of this?
We would report upon the purpose and the payments that were made in accordance with the language in the amendment. However, our ability to distinguish and to separate out a Canadian dollar within an AIB project from, for example, British dollar or an Australian dollar, whether or not that reporting requirement is there for a separate report, we're not able to distinguish out because of the way that the bank functions, which Neil has explained in some detail. So that money goes to broader bank capital, so it's not dollar by dollar that we're able to track. We will, of course, continue to report on the activities of Canadian international assistance funding, regardless of this amendment, if it's a separate report or if it's incorporated into other transparent reporting, that would of course cover the AIB, but the reporting would be similar to the reporting that we have for other development banks, where we're not able to distinguish and track Canadian dollars separate from the projects that the bank is funding as a whole. So again, we can't distinguish from a Canadian dollar from Australian from a British dollar in these cases with these banks. And that's also how it works for World Bank, for Inter-American Development Bank, Asia Development Bank, and the EBRD.
Does that conclude the discussion on NDP 2? Okay, the question, all those in favor of NDP 2 on clause 176, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Fergus.
Je vote contre.
Mr. Cervera.
No.
Ms. O'Connell.
No.
Mr. Grewal.
No.
Mr. McLeod.
No.
Mr. Albus.
Yes.
Mr. Kmiec.
Yes.
Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Mr. Dussault.
Oui.
The amendment is lost. Turning to clause 176, shall clause 176 carry? Thank you, witnesses. Shall clause 176 carry on division? On division. There are no amendments from clauses 177 to 196, which includes Division 4, Division 3, Division 4, Division 5, Division 6, and part of Division 7. Shall clauses 177 to 196 carry? On division? On division. Okay, clause 197, Mr. Dussault, NDP 3.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et on change.
Thank you very much, Chair. We're changing topics here. We're coming back to the Canada Labour Code and the changes, the many changes that are being made to the Canada Labour Code. My comments will therefore pertain to that part of the bill. First of all, I will deal with the substitution on of lines 55 to 52 of the term 7 days. Here it's 24 hours. On line 5, they say the employee can advise at least 24 hours ahead of time and about a need for a family leave, a personal leave. And today, 24 hours advance notice is very little. Particularly, very often they have to do more time, and I would think that 24 hours is perhaps an exaggeration. We therefore propose that it should be 1 week, 7 days in the first part of the amendment if you want to change shifts. And this is in line with what is to be found in the testimony given to us by the witnesses who came to the committee. And also in my amendments of B and C, we propose the elimination of identical lines 21 and 22 in English, 22 and 23 in French on page 252, and the deletion of lines 19 and 20 on page 254 in English. lines 26 and 22, page 254 in French. This is to alter the exemptions, the exceptions, but the exemptions that the employer can use for refusing a shift change. And the way it is written now, where it indicates where it could be a serious effect on the normal way of operation of the employer. And for us, this is far too broad. Far too broad. The refusal of the employer could quite simply be based on that this could have a negative effect on the establishment. What does that mean when you consider the words? Well, the employer could say, well, it will interfere with the operation of my plant or my workplace. So it's the scope is far, far too large, too broad rather, and this is why we are proposing our amendments. A and B, and we delete C in both cases. I do hope to have the support of my colleagues on these matters so that these new changes to the Canadian Labour Code will be fair, will be possible. Because if you give such excuses that are so broad and so general to the employer, well, it will be constantly refused. But also, the broad scope of the exemptions may well not be perfectly aligned with what is in the legislation. So I do hope that I will gain the support of my colleagues for the three parts of my amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Dussault, and we're dealing with Part 5, Division 8. If there's any officials in the room that want to come to the table in case there's questions on the Canada Labour Code. Thank you for that. Then turning to, and we have a vote in about 11:08, in about 25 minutes. So are we okay to go to about 11 o'clock? We got agreement to do that? Okay, then Mr. Albas.
Yes, just thank you, Mr. Chair. And while I've been very supportive of Mr. Duclos today, it's Dussault, pardon me. I would like just to ask a few questions because I'm not sure of the entire effect of his amendments. Could I ask officials just to break down the amendment that the NDP have proposed, clause, or proposal by proposal, and just what that would mean?
You have the copy of the amendment, do you? Yes. Okay, Ms.
Unfortunately, we can't hear the question.
Oh, I asked you to break it down.
Which one in particular?
His amendment that he just spent the last few minutes speaking about. So again, that would be NDP 3.
NDP 3, yeah. You'd just like us to walk you through what it would do?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. The amendment, the motion, would amend the legislation to require an employer to provide at least 7 days' notice rather than 24 as set out in the legislation, prior to changing a period or shift during which an employee is due to work, or adding another work period or shift to an employee's schedule. The second amendment proposes to remove the exception where an employer would not be required to provide advance notice of a change in situations where the change to or addition of a work period or shift is necessary to deal with a situation that the employer could not have reasonably foreseen and that presents or could reasonably be expected to present an imminent or serious threat of serious interference with the ordinary working of the employer's industrial establishment. The third amendment proposes to remove the exception that would not allow an employee to refuse to work overtime to fulfill family responsibilities where it is necessary for them to work overtime to deal with a situation that the employer could not have reasonably foreseen and that presents or could reasonably be expected to present an imminent or serious threat of serious interference with the ordinary working of the employer's industrial establishment.
Okay.
Just to clarify, because it may show up on the record wrong, I think you meant the difference between 7 days and 24 hours. The way you stated it, it almost sounded like 24 days. So that would be the difference, right?
We can't hear. I'm very sorry, we can't hear.
That's strange. Try the earpiece. My point was, just for the record, in your response, you said the difference between 7 days and 24, and I really think you meant 24 hours.
Yes, I did. My mistake.
Okay,
I'm sorry for the confusion.
Mr. Albas, any further questions?
No, I just wanted to run through it. Thank you.
Any further discussion on NDP 3? Then calling the question.
Recorded.
Recorded vote. Madam Clerk on NDP 3.
Mr. Fergus. Mr. Sorbera.
Nope.
Ms. O'Connell. No. Mr. Grewal.
No.
Mr. McLeod.
No.
Mr. Albas.
Contre.
Mr. Kimiech.
No.
Mr. Kelly.
No.
Mr. Dussault.
Oui.
The amendment is lost. Shall clause 197 carry on division? Clause 198, shall clause 198 carry on division? Then clause 199, we have CPC 3 in the name of Mr. Albas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and colleagues. We did hear testimony from the CFIB in regards to concerns that smaller and medium-sized enterprises may not be able to comply in a timely way from the requirement in the legislation that the changes to the requirement for an employee to be notified of whether their flexible work arrangement has been approved from 30 days. My proposal is just to simply bump it up to 90 days, which, given the complexity and diversity of the federal regulated labor space, I believe would give those small and medium-sized business the capacity to be able to respond in a timely way. Again, 30 days I believe is too quick. 90 days is still within enough of a timely basis without providing too much of an onerous side. So I would hope that members of the committee would give it all due consideration, and I look forward to hearing some support from all sides. Thank you.
Is there any further discussion? No further discussion? Go ahead.
To the witnesses, these changes would only apply to federally regulated workplaces, correct?
Federally regulated private sector workplaces.
Federally regulated private sector
Not
workplaces.
the federal public service.
Not the federal. Okay, thank you. And second of all, has it generally been a tradition where legislation introduced by the federal government for federally regulated private workplaces is then adopted by the provinces to cover their jurisdiction as well?
As you know, under the Constitution, responsibilities for labor issues is shared between the federal government and the provinces and territories. The federal government, with respect to Part 3, which is the part that relates to flexible work arrangements, applies to the federally regulated private sector. Provinces and territories have it within their full domain to make legislation changes to their labor standards that affect those workers and those workplaces within their jurisdiction.
Okay. Thank you. That's it.
Mr. Albas?
Thank you, and I just want to clarify that again, the people that I'm thinking about, Mr. Chair, we're not thinking of so much the Bank of Montreal or RBC or some of the other large federally regulated private workspaces. We are thinking of, trucking companies that are small, that are doing interprovincial. We're thinking about the many railroads that cross provincial boundaries, but may not necessarily have the same capacity as the larger ones. The small companies that perhaps are doing work offshore of Canada in the oil and gas. So for them to be able, and to be fair, oftentimes these small firms, they, to keep their staff, they already do these things on a regular basis. What we are talking about is the administrative burden of instead of it being 30 days hard and fast, that they have 90 days to come up with a full scheme and to submit that. So I would hope that there would be some flexibility because this is an area that we should not be adding more burden to those small firms that are already struggling. Again, it's one more disincentive from performing and hiring. Again, if there's new requirements that come on, especially with a diverse workplace, again, some people may say, I don't want to hire, given the uncertainty or given the extra paperwork. We want to avoid that.
Okay, then we're ready for the question. All those in favor of the amendment to CPC 3, recorded vote, Madam Chair.
Madam Clerk.
Madam Clerk.
Mr. Fergus.
Je vote contre.
Mr. Sorbera.
No.
Ms. O'Connell.
No.
Mr. Graywall.
No.
Mr. McLeod.
No.
Mr. Albas.
Yes.
Mr. Kmiec.
Yes.
Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Mr. Dussault.
No.
Then the amendment is lost. Shall Clause 199 carry on division? On division. There's no amendments to clauses 200 to 205. Shall clauses 200 to 205 carry on division? On division. Clause 206, we have an amendment, NDP 4. We might get through one amendment before we have to leave. Mr. Dussault.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et je vais essayer d'être rapide.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief, although this amendment is a fairly broad one, which aims to amend 3 parts to these changes to the Canadian Labour Code. Firstly, family leave. Secondly, leave for victims of family violence. And thirdly, leave of absence for traditional Aboriginal practices. So when it comes to family obligation leave, instead of being a 3-day non-remunerated leave of absence, I would say that it should be a remunerated leave of 5 days. The second amendment is for leave for victims of domestic violence. So this leave would be for 10 days with pay, while currently it's a 10-day leave of absence without pay. And this is in line with what numerous witnesses have told us. Numerous witnesses have spoke to us about this, told us that 10 days of unremunerated leave is not enough for victims of domestic violence. A man or woman who is a victim of spousal or familial violence, who needs to leave their living environment, who might need to visit a shelter, is not able to take a 10-day unremunerated leave when they're fleeing from their partner's violence. I think that's very clear from what we've heard from the witnesses. Victims may choose to endure the violence or they'll decide not to use this leave because they can't leave their living conditions when they're not going to get paid for those 10 years, because the people are often in precarious living situations. So it's ridiculous for us to say, okay, fine, you can flee your abusive living situation, but we'll give you 10 days of unpaid leave. There's no problem there. No, it can't be. It's obvious that that's not adequate. So this amendment aims to make this a paid leave of absence. And then the other thing that has been mentioned by numerous witnesses, I'm sure you all remember this, the other thing then is that 206.7 paragraph 3, the exceptions, so in this clause, we don't want to give leave to the violent members of the family who might want to take advantage of the leave. But what has been said here is that in various provinces, there are principles of where when police officers arrive on the scene of domestic violence, they're going to charge both of the individuals because the officer might not be familiar with all of the issues going on. So they're going to charge both individuals, bring them to the police station. And then once both parties have been questioned, sometimes it becomes clear that only one of the two is the source of the problem and has violated the criminal code. So only one of the two is going to be charged. So this means that the victims in these situations where both are taken in for questioning are not going to be able to take advantage of this domestic leave, or domestic violence leave rather. And I don't think that's right. I understand the intentions, but there's going to be collateral victims because of this exception, and people who won't be able to take advantage of the leave of absence. So I think it's completely logical to eliminate that exception. And that way we won't simply do the opposite of what we wanted to do. And I'm not the one who's making this up about the cases where both parties are charged. Plenty of witnesses have told us about these situations, and they're worried that this exception is going to prevent people from taking advantage of the leave. And now, quickly, the other change is the leave for traditional Aboriginal practices. So, again, to make that paid leave, in the same line of ideas as my other changes, so as to make this paid leave. And the other thing is to give the governor and council additional regulatory powers to consult Indigenous governments and organizations in order to add traditional Indigenous practices to the list set out in subsection 1, where we have hunting, gathering, picking, and other practices under regulation. But if we want to add these practices under regulation, we need to consult Indigenous governments and organizations, because with all due respect, it's not public servants who can make those decisions about whether such and such is or is not a traditional Indigenous practice and whether it should be regulated into existence. There needs to be consultation in order to ensure that we duly respect the rights of Indigenous people. So that's what this amendment is about, and I hope it will lead to a fruitful debate so that everyone can get their points across, and I hope that most of my colleagues will support this amendment.
Discussion on this amendment. Mr. Fergus?
Tout d'abord, j'aimerais remercier
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank my colleague for having raised this point. When we heard from the departmental representatives in committee, this is an issue that has greatly concerned me. I've looked for further details. Unfortunately, I don't think that the amendments you have proposed will fully fix this issue that we all recognize. The situation where charges are brought to two parties in situations of domestic violence, situations where both partners will be charged initially, and then later it will become clear that the burden of evidence shows that only one of those parties is going to be charged and that only one person is a true victim. So can our witnesses respond to some questions that I have?
When we come back, we'll have to suspend and go to a vote, but I just would mention to members, when we do come back, we will have the Iraqi delegation here, and we will meet with them first. The meeting will be suspended, so we will have separate interpretive devices. We'll chat. We'll turn the chairs. The Staff will set it up so that we can have a quick meeting with them, and then we'll come back to business. So, meeting is suspended until after the vote. Here we shall reconvene, and again, thank you to the. It was a pleasure to meet with the Iraqi Finance Committee here, and we wish you well in your deliberations over the remainder of your time in Canada. So when we suspended, we were dealing with NDP Amendment 4 to Clause 206, and Mr. Fergus, you had the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Alors, ma question se pose vraiment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a question for our two witnesses. My question is, well, I want to make sure about something. The objective of this clause was to ensure that victims of violence will have leave that they can take. There will be a type of leave available for them. And they'll have the time to fix the problems related to their very difficult situation.
We're not getting anything.
Just make sure you're in channel 1, should be English.
Yep.
Okay, go ahead.
Alors, ça, c'est une question à M. Gagnon, Mme Hill. Alors,
Testing that the interpretation works. Do you hear the interpreter? I just wanted to ask about the victims. Even if there are dual charges laid in some provincial jurisdictions, I want to ensure that the employer still has the flexibility to ensure that the employer will have to give the victim leave. Is that indeed the case? Have I understood that correctly?
Very important to remember that the Canada Labour Code establishes minimum standards and is always aimed at balancing employee and employer needs and interests. The employer is always has the discretion to provide more than the minimum standards provided in the code. There is nothing that prevents them from doing that in the code. So in the case of domestic violence leave, an employer can always provide leave for someone they think would benefit from it as a result of victims of them being a victim of family violence. They could always pay the leave, should they wish, and they can always provide more leave if the employer wishes.
So I just want to make sure, the idea again is that we certainly don't want the perpetrator of the violence to have access to this, but in a case where there are double charges or mutual charge in cases of violence in those jurisdictions, we are also not creating, this is not an unintended consequence, that the person who is a victim or the preponderant victim of the violence is not going to be penalized by these measures as the clause is currently written. Am I correct?
You are absolutely correct.
Can you talk a little bit, can you just reassure the committee, because I just want to make sure we got this right, because this is not a partisan issue at all. And this is an issue which I think is very important that we ensure that those who, you know, not all charges are the same. And we just want to make sure that the real perpetrator of the violence is the one that will not be eligible for this congé. Puis deuxièmement, je veux m'assurer que
for this leave, and secondly, I want to ensure that the victim will be able to get that leave.
That the intent of this leave is to provide an employee who is a victim of family violence, to take leave in order for them to deal with the situation in their life or the situation in the life of a minor child. The Canada Labour Code provides minimum standards. An employer always has the right to be more generous, and we know that many employers do this. They are more generous. I would also say that reflecting the fact that the new leave is intended to provide people who are in horrific circumstances with leave, that it only provides one specific circumstance when someone would not have that right. And that right is, if through the justice system, they are identified as the perpetrator. And I would say also that the exception reinforces that the employer can provide leave in the case where it is probable, not possible, but probable in the circumstances that the individual is a victim of domestic violence. Do you want to perpetrator, sorry, the perpetrator.
Mr. Albus.
Just the question I would ask is that some witnesses brought up that there are some jurisdictions that, as a matter of course, will charge in a domestic dispute to anyone that's involved. So what effects would that dual charging, first of all, does that occur? And then second of all, how would that impact without this amendment?
You want to take it?
You said without the amendment or with the amendment?
Well, actually, with and
Okay.
we'll start with the amendment, please.
Okay, so without the amendment as is written now. What section, paragraph 3 does, subsection 3 does, is actually remove the title you have in subsection 2. Okay, so the leave, the employee is entitled, and the exception is not entitled. There's nothing in there that says the employer is banned from, or the employer is not allowed to. And of course, the employer here cannot substitute himself for a judicial system about say who says who and all that stuff. So the person has experienced violence in his or her life, and the person is not at work that day and calling whatever person is a shelter or a police station and all that and say, I cannot go in. I'll let you know later on, but there's violence in my life. That's all the person needs to say. Then eventually, the employer, as you know, may request after that kind of explanation and or documentation. But then the question is, can the employer say, okay, that's okay, I understand, give you the leave. And I think maybe I'm implying here that can the employer take reprisals because the person was not entitled, okay, but doesn't mean the employer cannot give it. And there's a section in the Act that prevents from reprisals for applying for a leave. So the employee, eventually is recognized, well, we don't need here to be guilty, need here to be accused. So the person is accused, but eventually, no, he shouldn't have been accused and all that. Then it's an issue to be between the employer and the employee, but it's an unpaid leave, and the person was already absent, but the employer cannot make reprisals against the employee. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, I was asking about the cases where we heard from witnesses saying that there could be potential impacts in regards to dual charges being laid, and I was asking specific that if that had anything to do with this conversation, if there's any jurisdictions that do that, because again, I just remember one witness is raising that there was a concern that could happen.
Just to clarify, when you say dual charges, you mean there were two individuals involved in one incident?
My understanding is that one witness had said that there are some jurisdictions which will, as a matter of fact, just charge any participants in a domestic assault, not knowing the particulars. And I hadn't heard of that before, so I'm asking the question: is that something that is done in some provinces or territories? And if so, how would that factor in with this amendment or with the bill in general?
We're not aware of that situation.
Okay, that's helpful to me. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Dussault.
Je suis surpris que...
Well, I'm surprised that you are not aware of that possibility, and yet the legislation is clear. If charges have been laid, and we're not talking about later steps in the proceedings, we're just talking about charges. The very first step that occurs when there is a criminal offense. I just thought that was too broad. I proposed removing this completely to avoid having this kind of situation occur. Would it be possible to mention that only victims have a right to this leave? I understand that we can't put the employer into a situation where they are judging a domestic conflict and they get to decide who's a victim and who isn't. That's not the employer's business. Is there a way to address this problem? Do you recognize that it's a problem? That there are cases where dual charges are laid and that someone who's a victim can't be accused? And so the employer might say, well, you don't have any right to this leave.
We are not aware of provincial police practices with respect to charging people involved in incidents of domestic violence. That's what I interpreted the question to be. The purpose of this exception provision and why it's important to keep it is to set a high and fair threshold for denying people who are experiencing violence in their life the right to take the proposed leave. The exception provision allows the leave to be denied in only two circumstances, the ones I mentioned earlier. If the provision was removed, an employee who's charged with an offense, as you noted, related to the act of family violence for which they're requesting leave. That's a formal process, being charged with an offense. That involves the judicial system. That individual could benefit from the leave if the exception is removed. In addition, an employee who probably, considering the circumstances, committed the act, which means that it's very likely, not just possible, that the employee is the perpetrator of the violence, they would also be able to benefit from the leave.
Mais justement, est-ce qu'il y a une solution pour...
Well, is there a solution to this situation? A solution that does not involve discussing the charges, given that sometimes there are dual charges? Is there something in between? The problem with using the definition of a victim is that it can take time to know who is the perpetrator, which of the two is the perpetrator, and so then the leave hasn't worked for anything, hasn't been worth anything if the justice system decides a couple years later that such and such is the victim and such is the perpetrator. Sorry, I'm using the English word. But ultimately, if we're waiting for the victim to be recognized before they can take the leave, that's way too long. And you're not concerned that real victims may not get to take their leave even though they do have a right to it? We did hear that from witnesses. Are you concerned that that situation might arise?
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So just to reiterate, the objective is to set a high and fair threshold to make sure that people who are in situations of family violence are not denied the leave. I would also, and we think that this is a good balance. I would also draw the committee's attention to the fact that this exception mirrors exactly the one in the code that relates to leave related to the death or disappearance of a child as a result of a crime. It's exactly the same provision.
Okay, ça le fait pas mieux parce qu'il y en a un autre ailleurs.
All right, then on NDP 4, amendment to clause 206. Are we ready for the question? Do you want a recorded vote?
Yes.
Madam Clerk.
Mr. Fergus.
Avec beaucoup de regrets, je vais voter.
Great regret, I'm going to vote against this.
No.
Ms. O'Connell? No. Mr. Grewal?
No.
Mr. McLeod?
No.
Mr. Albas?
Yes.
Mr. Kmiec?
Yes.
Mr. Schmale?
Yes.
Monsieur Dussault?
Oui.
The amendment is lost. Turning to amendment NDP 5, Mr. Dussault.
Thank you. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et ma prochaine amendement, c'est encore en lien avec la même partie.
The next amendment is also about the same part of the bill, and it's in two places where on page 260 and 261, there are two places where we refer to leave which can be 1 day or more. So it's on 260, lines 26 and 27. in one place it says that the leave can be taken in one or more periods. The employer may require that each period of leave be of not less than 1 day's duration. And some witnesses said that this makes no sense. First of all, the first time we see a mention of this leave, it's for family reasons. And then later, it's mentioned in connection with the family violence leave. So when it comes to family obligations, we're forced to take an entire day. If there's a family situation that arises and you have to leave, you have to take the entire day off, unremunerated, since my amendment was defeated. So you're not being paid and you have to take the entire day. You can't take the afternoon off. You have to take the entire day off. And that makes no sense, given the real-life situations of Canadians, where they might get up to 3 days. Unfortunately, my amendment was not adopted, where they could have had up to 5, but they have 3 days per year, but they have to take it at least for 1 day at a time or more. They can't say that they're taking 3 days. So it's not like saying you can take 22.5 hours a year. It's really 3 days. So my amendment aims to remove what's after the semicolon in both cases. That's in the French, and in the English, we believe that it should end after the word periods. In both cases, it should end after the word periods, followed by a period. So we can leave out the sentence that says that the employer may require that each period of leave be not less than 1 day's duration. And I think that makes sense given what we've heard from witnesses. It could become necessary for someone to take 1, 2, 5 hours, not necessarily the whole day, for family obligation reasons. I think this makes sense and it's a very reasonable amendment. It does not go against the spirit of what is being proposed here. It just gives most flexibility to people when they take their leave.
Mr. Fergus.
I'd like to ask Ms. Hill or Mr. Gagnon. It seems to me that the following sentence after this amendment, the part that be removed, it says the employer may require that each. Sorry. Let me start again. To read the entire definition of the division of leaves, subsection 4 of clause 206.7, it says that the leave of absence may be taken in one or more periods. The employer may require that, and then I say may require that each period of leave be of not less than 1 day's duration. Ms. Hill, can you explain why the legislation is written that way, please?
I think you've zeroed in on exactly the correct word, and that's may. The purpose of this provision is to recognize the intent of the new leave for employees, but also to recognize that there's always a need to balance those against the needs of employers. So there's nothing in the legislation as it is now that prohibit an employer from providing the leave in any amount of time that they wish. Very important to notice, very important to recognize that in many industrial sectors and types of businesses in the federally regulated private sector, it may be very difficult for operational or administrative reasons for some employers to let their employees take time off for a few hours and return to work afterwards in the same day. In the consultations that were held prior to this legislation being developed, that was something that came across very strongly from employers, large employers as well as small ones. So the legislation as it is now provides employers with the flexibility to require that the leave be taken in periods of at least 1 full working day, but does not prohibit them from offering it in other periods.
Alors, pour préciser encore une fois, ça c'est une demande.
So, once again, I'd like to check that this flexibility has been asked for by employers. And the provisions of the legislation will allow employees to take part of the day off, or depending on the nature of the job or business, employers can stipulate that employees can take only part of the day, or the entire day off, rather.
That is correct. That's what you said. Any further discussion then on Amendment NDP 5 to Clause 202? Madam Clerk.
Mr. Fergus?
Je vote contre.
Mr. Sabera?
No.
Ms. O'Connell?
No.
Mr. Graywell?
No.
Mr. McLeod?
No.
Mr. Albus?
No.
Mr. Kmiec?
No.
Mr. Schmale?
No.
Mr. Dussault?
Oui.
The amendment is lost. Turning to Amendment PV3, Ms. May, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Returning on the same basket of amendments to the concerns about ensuring that these welcome provisions to provide leave for people who are the victims of violence are meaningful. I refer specifically to the testimony in drawing up this amendment, testimony from the Canadian Labour Congress and the Canadian Union of Public Employees, that financial security is essential for people who are victims of violence. In the interest of time, I'll only refer to one bit of the testimony from Elizabeth Dandy, who's referring to the fact that, quote, survivors of family violence require stable, ongoing paid employment to enable them to leave violent relationships and seek safety. Many survivors won't be able to afford to take the leave if it is unpaid. So my amendment at this point, as you can see, changes line 10 on page 261 to include is entitled to and shall be granted a leave of absence with pay. That's my amendment, and I hope that members of the government on this committee of the Liberal Party will consider and actually vote for this. It will strengthen C-63 in a way that you'll all be very proud of for a very long time. Thank you.
Any discussion on Ms. May's comments? Hearing none, then the question is called. All those in favor? Opposed? Lost. Ms. May, PV4.
Thank you. This is, again, an attempt to ensure that there is as much adequacy of the leave of absence as possible, and instead of saying that shall be not less than 1 day's duration, change to each period of leave may be of less than 1 day's duration. That is to make it workable in real life situations of people who've been victims of violence. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Is there any further discussion on Amendment PV4?
Yes.
Mr. Fergus.
So my question to Ms. Hill or Mr. Gagnon, what would be the implications of this change to go from a shall to a may?
Sorry, just to be certain, you're suggesting that the word may would be replaced with shall?
The contrary.
So an amendment to an amendment.
No, it would be no. That's. I'm sorry. Maybe I misread Ms. May's amendment, but I thought that's
correct.
Thank you.
So the question is, if this motion would be accepted, this amendment, which we would read as last sentence, each period of leave may be of less than 1 day's duration. Am I correct?
No,
well,
that's an incorrect reading of the current.
No. Your
okay.
motion.
Of my amendment, yes, it's
yeah,
still.
your amendment.
Okay.
If
with my amendment, you could take less than a day. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, that is already what the language of the Act allows, like it was explained previously, that the employer may give less than a day, or if it's in operational or for whatever industrial sector and the reason of that he cannot allow, for example, an employer to go 2 hours and then let this employee come back for the rest of the day. In those circumstances, the employer has also the flexibility to request at least 1 day. So the flexibility of may be less than 1 day is already in the language of the provision.
Ms. May?
Just to explain, the discretion here is entirely the employer's to state that there will not be permissible leaves that are less than a day. And the evidence before the committee was that many survivors will require only an hour or two to attend to tasks, to attend to psychiatric appointments, counseling for their child, whatever is required. And that especially where leave is unpaid, to have to take a whole day at a minimum as opposed to part of a day is unnecessarily difficult and adds additional stress to the people that this bill is trying to help. So the change that I'm suggesting, just to be clear, is to put the benefit of this provision with the victim. Recognize the employer may prefer to say you have to take a whole day, I'm not going to give you part of a day. But I suggest that this is at least as important as a Canadian's right to vote, in which case employers must give every employee, regardless of their job category, the time it takes to run out and vote. I'm asking for the same degree of flexibility to allow a worker, an employee, who's dealing with a family member or themselves, the victim of violence, to be able, especially since it's not a paid leave, to be able to take just a few hours out of their day as a right, and not to give the employer the ability to say you have to take a whole day or nothing.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor of amendment PB4 to clause 206, all those in favor? Opposed? Amendment is lost. Shall clause 206 carry? On division? On division. Shall clauses 207 and 208 carry? On division. Clause 209, NDP 6. Mr. Dussault.
Mr. Chair, it was a consequential amendment if NDP 5 would have carried. In the fact that it didn't, I don't see the reason to debate this motion.
So it's withdrawn. Okay, then that's great. Shall clause 209 carry? On division? There's no amendments to clauses 210 to 261, which includes Division 9, Division 10, and Division 11. So shall Division 12. So shall clauses 209 and as well the Division 13. So shall clauses 210 to 261 carry? On division? On division. 261. Okay. We won't need that part here. So shall the short title carry? On division? On division. Shall the schedule carry? On division. Shall the title carry? On division. Shall the bill carry? On division. Okay, you want it? You will vote.
Vote.
Shall the bill carry? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Shall the chair report the bill to the House? Agreed.
We don't want to.
Agreed.
Love you too much. Chair's got to have some responsibility.
Then, Then thank you to the witnesses, Margaret and Rial, as well, for dealing with the Canada Labour Code Division. So with that, do we have any more business? I don't think we do we?
Budget we have to approve.
What's this?
C-63, this budget, did we pass it already?
We did pass the budget for the hearings for the study. Okay, with that, thank you. We could have went till 9 o'clock at night, but my golly, we made good progress. So thank you all, and the meeting adjourned.